What are some of the most effective therapies for fatigue? Today we'll explore diet as it pertains to fatigue, hormones, specifically thyroid hormone and fatigue, as well as Hashimoto's. And finally, we will also touch on how the gut is implicated in fatigue. And we'll explore this through a number of listener questions. Now, if you're new to the podcast, myself and 3 other doctors in our clinical practice, along with a supporting research team, are trying to answer your questions so we can share what we're finding in the clinic and with our research are the best methods for various challenges within healthcare, as this podcast will be dedicated to fatigue. So in a moment here, we'll go to an episode with Dr. Scott Spertigliozzi from the clinic and myself, again, going into these questions on fatigue and what we found to be the best way, in this case, predominantly to navigate diet, thyroid health, and gut health for improving fatigue. Dr. Scott, welcome back.
Hey, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, as promised, let's go into some questions on fatigue. And I've looked through these questions and I think they're excellent. Great job of sort of compiling these questions into groupings, because as I read through these this morning, there's so much interplay between the concepts. And I think some of the stumbling blocks people might get tripped up by regarding fatigue as something that I know you have struggled with, I have struggled with. It sucks. No one wants to be fatigued. So yeah, let's jump into some of these questions.
Awesome. Yep. All right. So first question is from Lee, and she says, I am perpetually exhausted after meals. If you complete an elimination diet like the autoimmune paleo diet and you identify some food triggers, but it doesn't resolve this post-meal fatigue, what next steps would you take to improve fatigue?
Great question. Fatigue can definitely be driven by the gut, as I know you know, but just to clarify for our audience, and I would argue that's probably a fairly prominent cause or driver of fatigue, especially if you notice you eat and then you immediately or shortly after the meal experience fatigue. And this is something I remember I used to, way back when I was in school, I got on kind of a nut butter kick. And I'm a little bit intolerant to nuts. I can do some, but there's a threshold. And I remember, I'm going to have all this healthy almond butter and on an apple, and 20 minutes later, just was exhausted. And it happened enough times where I figured out, okay, I have a certain threshold for how much nuts I can tolerate. Now, today I'm much more tolerant as my gut health has improved, my tolerance has improved. But for someone like Lee, who is probably still in a position where her gut is sensitive, that's where this food reactive fatigue and food reactive brain fog can really be a problem. So great first step in terms of going through the autoimmune paleo, which is a pretty strict elimination, and determining or trying to determine what your triggers are. But to your question, Lee, what if you've done that? What if you've gone all the way to the autoimmune paleo diet, which is pretty restrictive, and you're still experiencing post-meal fatigue and you can't figure out what the trigger is or what the triggers are, as was the same thing that happened to me? It's likely that there's a non-dietary issue that's driving your fatigue. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we need to bring to your gut therapies that can reduce inflammation, rectify dysbiosis, correct leaky gut. The specifics of what is happening kind of doesn't matter, because we use this model in the clinic called evidence-based empiricism, meaning what therapies have been shown to improve gut health in randomized clinical trials, and then we personalize them based upon your symptomatic response, which means we don't have to blow thousands of dollars and say, there's this much dysbiosis, this much leaky gut, whatever. So to your question, what can you do next? There are many things on offer in the gut health toolkit. The 2 that I think you may want to consider starting with would be a combination of probiotics and gut supportive or gut repair nutrients. Now, specifically, and what I use every morning is our triple therapy probiotic. This is essentially 7 capsules of probiotic in a single serving tear stick, kind of like an electrolyte pack. So I would consider using 1 or 2 packets of the triple therapy probiotic plus gut rebuild nutrients, and do that for about a month and then reevaluate. By a month, you should either be seeing notable improvement or you won't be noticing improvement. Now, it's not to say that you'll see everything resolved at the end of a month, but it should be a fairly clear, yes, I'm improving, keep going if so, or no, I'm not improving. Now, another method that you could integrate in with this is an elemental diet reset. And this is where you use an elemental diet either exclusively or to obtain most of your calories for anywhere from 1 to 4 days. And the elemental diet is a hypoallergenic meal replacement. And if that's helpful and that feels good, after that 1 to 4 day reset, you can continue using the elemental diet to replace maybe half of your calories per day and use that for a few weeks and then sort of taper off. And the way you can think about the application of the elemental diet is almost like an ankle brace. It can be helpful for a little while, and then maybe a month in or so, you can start weaning yourself off the brace and then you don't need it anymore. There are other things that can be done, but in terms of where is there good evidence, what therapies are well studied, safe, and effective, again, I think the triple therapy probiotic, or just really any probiotic, but my preference would be the triple therapy, plus a gut supportive formula like gut rebuild nutrients, plus or minus the use of an elemental diet reset, is a great place to start. Remember that if the intervention is working by the month mark or even a touch less, again, you're looking for, yes, I'm improving, or no, I'm not. If we're doing the right stuff, we should see noticeable symptomatic improvement within usually a 2 to 4 week period. Now, it's not to say, again, all of the improvements will be realized, but the first checkpoint is, are we doing the right thing? Yes or no. If yes, continue. If no, change to something else. And I just mentioned that because you don't want to stay in a trial longer than you need to, because that will thwart that next trial and diminish, the speed at which you're able to recover from the fatigue. So great start with the autoimmune paleo diet. And from here, I would shift your thinking to there's probably a non-dietary driver. And this is where the couple things I outlined can really help with that.
Awesome. And what's the, I guess, estimated timeline of somebody like Lee being able to, reintroduce foods and not experience this post-meal fatigue? Like, is there a certain timeline where you see people can finally eat the foods that were causing or contributing to some of their fatigue?
Yeah, great. This is a great question. Usually you'll see some improvement in tolerance maybe within the first month or 2. However, the way I like to do this, and this I think is something that's up for debate, but at least clinically in monitoring many patients, this seems to be the most efficient trajectory, big picture. We try not to do too much in the way of reintroduction until someone has seen most of their symptoms improve. It's not to say they're going to be at 100%, but they're at least toward that sort of 70, 80%. Yeah, I feel significantly better. I'm fairly stable in this improvement. Okay, now we have a baseline against which we can reintroduce foods, and it's easier to tell if the food was a problem or was not a problem. And again, there's 2 reasons why this is helpful. Having the consistent baseline so that you can not be confused by, if you feel a dip in your wellness, that could have been a coincidence if you're still in this sort of up and down pattern. And then you may falsely say, oh, it was the gluten that made me feel bad. Well, this is why we need that consistent baseline. And then 2, as the gut lining heals, more enzymes are released. Histamine degrading enzymes, lactose degrading enzymes, and things like dysbiosis or overgrowth usually improve as your symptoms improve. So food tolerance to things like prebiotics and FODMAPs should also go up. So giving the gut a little bit of time to heal usually improves tolerance, kind of like an ankle sprain. You could run, but if you try to run at 3 weeks, you may re-injure. So if you wait, let's say, to 2 months, that's when the probability of being able to run without any re-injury risk is probably optimal. So wait until you're at a somewhat consistent baseline of improvements. And that's usually going to occur anywhere, if you're fast in response, a month. If you're a little bit slower, maybe 3 to 4. But definitely go through the exercise of reintroduction. And Scott, such a great question, because you don't want to assume foods that bothered me on day 1 are still bothering me day 30, day 60, day 90. For some people, it's day 365, and they're still avoiding that food. And I can say for myself personally, there were many foods like almonds that I didn't tolerate day 1 that now I'm pretty good with. I mean, there's still a threshold, but nowhere near as sensitive as I used to be.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Next question is from John. So I eat a low carb diet because from what I've read, it seems like that's just the best way to go. Since being low carb, though, I've just been really tired and my sleep hasn't been as good. I'm worried about eating more carbs, but I'm not sure what to do. So how would you help John here?
Well, John, firstly, do not worry about eating carbs. This is one of so many examples where health gurus will look at people, let's say in the US, eat packaged food, processed food. It's higher in calories. It's higher in both carbs and fat. And therefore, this is where something like the diabetes epidemic is coming from. And they really miscontextualize that that doesn't mean that rice, potatoes, fruit, what have you, are equally as culpable for metabolic problems as highly processed food. And why this is so pernicious and so damaging is exactly what you're suffering with, is people forge these unhealthy perspectives on food. So firstly, don't worry. Again, as long as you're not eating processed, highly processed packaged food as the majority of your carbohydrate source. And also realize that for some people, low carb and or keto does not work at all. And I am one of those people where if I go keto, my sleep is hellacious. So it sounds like you're in a similar camp. And a big credit, at least for me, to Mike Nelson. When I was doing some programming with Mike Nelson, he was dialing in my diet and my nutrition. He brought down my fat and upped my carbs. And I remember thinking, I'm going to, what is he trying to do? Is he trying to bulk me up? And I actually lost body fat while doing that. And that was likely because I have or had a tendency to overeat healthy fats. So when Mike Nelson recommended me to bring down my fat and up my carbs, I got some of the macronutrients, carbs that I needed for better performance. They seemed to be more satiating. And because of that, my total calorie consumption went down. Therefore, I lost some fat, my performance went up, and that worked really well. And I did not all of a sudden have diabetes because I was eating rice. So this for me was something I really changed my opinion on, because I came from a similar place of kind of being scared of carbs because of all the messaging you hear about carbs. That's, in my opinion, very sort of absolutist. Carbs are good, carbs are bad. Yeah, I mean, join the club of people who do not do well on low carb or on keto. I would certainly consider upping your carbs. I would not be afraid that eating minimally or unprocessed carbs in a whole food form, like rice, like certain breads, cereals, potatoes, sweet potatoes, fruits, are going to cause a frank problem with your blood sugar. And ultimately, listen to your body. If your sleep improves, if your energy improves, if your athletic performance improves, that tells you that you're doing the right thing. Also bear in mind that to some extent, carbs and fat should have an inverse relationship in the diet. So when you go low carb, you can go higher fat. When you go higher carb, you should also buffer that by bringing down your fat consumption slightly. You don't have to be anal about it. Just look for easy ways to reduce your fat intake. If you're eating avocado, maybe eat a little bit less. If you're using oils to cook with, maybe use a little bit less. And certainly if you've been doing low carb or keto, you might be liberally adding fats. So just start pruning that back as you bring in some of the fruits and starches and things like that.
So there's another great example of listening to your body, and your body is the boss, right? That's what
Your body's the
Dr.
boss.
Michael Ruscio said.
Yeah. And be careful of dietary dogma, which is really pervasive. But, part of the reason why that is, Scott, I know you know this, but extremes sell, right? When someone tells you about how bad carbs are, and it's just a simple dichotomy, carbs are bad, therefore this thing is good. Don't have to think about it. Do this one thing. It's easier from a messaging perspective, but it's not really true. There's a range of different diets on offer, and some work well for some people. Keto works great for some people. It does not work good for others. So important just to also keep that in mind.
All right, next question, a thyroid question from Sharon. So, hello, I suddenly became very tired and gained weight. My free T3 was low, and TPO antibodies were 33, which the doctor said was high. And my T4 and TSH are all in the normal range. So what do you think I should focus on to heal and improve my fatigue?
Great question. Firstly, let's take the T3. Low T3 is not a thyroid problem. It's a metabolic problem, meaning there's inflammation, there's stress, there's poor sleep, there's inadequate calories, inadequate carbs. So very important to keep in mind that low T3 does not tell you how well the thyroid gland is doing. Because remember, the thyroid gland makes T4, predominantly T4. It makes a little bit of T3, but predominantly what is produced by the gland is T4. It then goes into circulation, partially attached to sex hormone binding globulin, and kind of hops off in the periphery and gets converted into T3. So the conversion of the T4 into the T3 is dependent on a healthy milieu, if you will. Meaning, if you're inflamed, if you're stressed, if you're not eating enough, etc., the body does not convert as much T4 into T3. And some have theorized this happens because it's the body trying to protect itself, meaning T3 is somewhat stimulating. And if you either are overly stimulated or you have more stress and you can recover from, more stimulation might be a bad thing. Again, this is just kind of a rough theoretical analogy, but I think the analogy holds, which is there are certain situations where the body is trying to produce less T3 as an adaptation. So that doesn't mean we should just say, oh, well, give T3 and force that number up, but we should be looking upstream. What is it that's causing the body to not convert T4 into T3? And again, let's look at the things like inflammation, which the gut is probably the chief source of inflammation for most people, sleep, stress, caloric intake, carb intake. So the T3 tells us almost nothing about thyroid function, but it does tell us something else is going on in the body that needs to be addressed. Now, it's not as sexy, right? It's not, well, this one thing, and if we just give you that hormone, everything will be better. But this is actually much more true. Regarding the TPO, 33, yay, celebrate. That is a great level of TPO. We've discussed many times in the podcast that if you're below 500, that's really where there is minimal risk of progression of Hashimoto's to hypothyroid. This is crucially important to understand because the amount of fear in the messaging around Hashimoto's is pretty out of control. At baseline, your risk of being Hashimoto's and converting to hypothyroid is maybe 9%, maybe 10%. Estimates vary, but it's not a high percentage. If your antibodies are below 500, it's even lower than that. So you are pretty much normal. You're right on the cusp of the cutoff. So I would not worry at all about your TPO antibodies. Now, if you have a family history of hypothyroid or another autoimmune condition, you may want to have your antibodies checked 6 months or yearly just to keep an eye on them. But overall, I'd be very happy with a TPO of 33. And the fact that the T4 and TSH are in the normal range tells us that your thyroid is functioning normally. So is the thyroid implicated in the fatigue here? Almost for certain, no. It's one of those upstream factors that can cause the T3 to be low, which could be inflammation. So if there's any digestive symptoms, consider any of the myriad items we discussed that can improve gut health. If you're not sleeping enough, do your best to improve that. Also, if you're not exercising, do your best to improve that. If you're avoiding food, maybe like I believe it was Lee who was afraid of carbohydrates, or not Lee, but whoever it was who was afraid of carbohydrates.
John,
sorry. Maybe you're eating too low carb or too low calorie, right? But the point is, there is a monkey wrench in the system that's causing the low T3, and that's probably also causing your fatigue. Now, the low T3 is not the cause of your fatigue. It's secondary to whatever the monkey wrench is upstream. So what you do, a little bit hard to say based upon this snippet, but what we can tell you is the likelihood of your thyroid being the problem, extremely low. So I would divert my focus now to these other things. Think about your GI, think about your lifestyle, think about your diet, and that gives you a fairly high probability that you'll resolve whatever it is that's causing the fatigue.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of this patient avatar that they have a lot of gut symptoms. They are restricting their food. They have more reactivity. They continue to restrict their food. And now they are not eating enough. And they're probably not sleeping well because they're not eating enough. And now they're worrying about the fact, what I eat next is going to cause symptoms. And their T3 is now low because they're not eating enough. They have gut symptoms. They're not sleeping well. And now they go to a doctor and they're coming from this more fear-based place. And so they're probably way more receptive to, oh, it's my T3. Okay, I'll take the T3 hormone. So that's kind of the patient avatar that just came to my mind, and just how susceptible
Scott,
somebody like that could be.
It's an amazing point. And also because let's say this doctor who's saying the TPO is high may also say, well, you can't eat gluten because we know gluten flares autoimmunity. So now this person who may have been baseline overly restrictive with their diet becomes even more restrictive. Their energy gets worse, their sleep gets worse, and this whole thing spirals out of control. So this is a great example of why sometimes we are so passionate about calling these things out, because we'll see this at the clinic. And it's so unfortunate when people are trying to get better, but they're being led down the path that makes them worse, as could very well be the case with a situation like this. So Sharon, there are solutions out there. You may want to reach out to our clinic or go through our thyroid course or read Healthy Gut, Healthy You. There are definitely some good resources out there. I'm a little suspicious of your provider saying that the TPO is high. That in my mind is a red flag. So be mindful of that.
All right. Next question from Sam, which he's saying that, so since reading your book, Healthy Gut, Healthy You, I sought out a local functional medicine practitioner to address my fatigue, and I have been taking the most supplements I've ever been taking, which is about 20 per day. After 1.5 months, I developed new symptoms since starting the supplements, including stomach pain, bowel movement changes, panic attacks even. The supplements do help with the fatigue and mood, and I've been telling myself to just trust the process. And I finally took the plunge to work with a professional, but just something feels wrong as I feel worse compared to when I started. So what are your thoughts here?
Sam, I 1000% understand where you're coming from. Scott, I know that you had mentioned on one of our last podcasts how a patient came in on a ton of supplements. You had them go through what we call a supplement holiday, to stop everything. And they felt better within, I think it was a few days to a week of just that one simple change. So yeah, Sam, I mean, again, this is why we are so passionate about calling these things out. As a quick aside, I think, everyone at the clinic is on the same page that the providers in this space, they're doing the best that they can. It's just the educational system has likely been too manipulated by lab companies and supplement companies, leading to this sort of testing heavy and or supplement heavy method of treatment, which is exactly what you're describing with the 20 some odd either pills or supplements per day. And one of the downsides to this, even though a clinician's probably trying to help and saying, let's use all these supports because all these things might be able to help you, there is such a thing as overtreatment. And what happens when you overtreat is some of the things may have a negative effect, and that might be due to intolerances. It might be to just pouring too much stuff into the gut. It might be both. But yeah, I mean, the fact that you're seeing the stomach pain, the bowel movement changes, the panic attacks, that's a big deal. Something in there is probably helping given the fact that your fatigue and mood are better. And this is why at the clinic, we really try to limit to only starting a couple supplements at a time. And maybe as an aside for our patients, because sometimes you get a patient who says, I want to do more. I want to go as fast as I can. And the point we often make is this is really the tortoise and the hare, right? The tortoise was faster out of the gate. I'm sorry, the hare was faster out of the gate, but he didn't cross the finish line before the tortoise, because the sort of slow, steady, methodical approach might allow us to see, okay, in the 20 some odd supplements that you could use, maybe 2 of those help with the fatigue and the mood. Great, we'll keep going with those. But maybe a few of the others cause stomach pain, bowel movement changes, and the panic attacks, so we don't want to continue using those. So you need to work with, or you should consider working with a provider who's going to be a bit more conservative, a bit more methodical, and a bit more minimalistic in their approach, because 20 supplements is a lot, and you probably don't need everything that you're on. Now, if you have confidence in your provider, maybe you have a follow-up conversation, you voice your concerns, give them a chance, and they seem to be receptive, great, then continue forward with them. But if they kind of double down and they tell you something like it's an onion and we have to stick with it and all these other things, they're really not listening to you. And remember, your body is boss, like we say, Scott. Then that's when I would consider finding another provider and looking for an approach that's more like what we do at the clinic, which is that evidence-guided empiricist. What therapies have adequate randomized control trial evidence, and then how can we apply them empirically, listening to your body's response to figure out what we use and what we don't use. So yeah, Sam, this is a all too common situation that occurs in the field. Again, give your provider the benefit of the doubt, have a conversation based upon the response, either continue or look for a second opinion. And if you need one, feel free to reach out to the clinic. We'd be happy to help you.
All right. Next question. Great question from Susan. So when I work out, weightlifting, about 2 times a week, I feel good. But if I do more than that, I feel more tired. So what should I do? Should I keep working out just twice per week?
Great question. And good job, Susan. I mean, I'm glad that you're working out twice per week and sort of being mindful and listening to your body. But what can we do here? The concept, and again, this is something that I really appreciated about Mike Nelson, is called progressive overload. Meaning, if you want to be working out 5 days per week and you're currently working out 2 days per week, jumping to 5 is probably too far of a reach. So we want to push your system enough to the point where it can recover and then become stronger and adapt to that new load. So I would try the gradual progression and see if the, let's say, 3rd day of working out per week maybe feels hard for the first 2 weeks, but then by week 3 or by week 4, you notice you adapt and you're no longer tired. And this has happened to me, Scott. I believe it's happened to you. Most recently, when I started doing these mountain bike rides along with a run at the end, the first week, it was tough. I was a little bit tired. I was pretty hungry. And it took me maybe 2 weeks to adapt to that. And now I can do those things and they feel totally normal. So one is just this gradual ramping up of the volume and see if the fatigue that you're experiencing will only be transient and will go away after a few weeks. Now, if the fatigue persists and you don't ever seem to be able to recover, then there may be things that you need to optimize. Sleep for recovery is huge. So if that's not something you're prioritizing, really consider looking at that more attentively. Protein intake. If you're not getting in, and the ranges here vary, but I think at least in your ramping up and acclimation phase, consider a higher protein intake of 1 gram per pound of body weight. And then from there, you can likely drop that down a little bit, but the protein may be one of the limiting factors for your recovery. And then there are certain recovery aids, as you've probably heard of. Sauna is fantastic. And my opinion is that almost everyone could benefit from buying a sauna. And you can get the sauna pods for like $200, the ones that your kind of head pops out and you sit. And then you can get a infrared sauna for about $1,000. You can get a traditional electrical sort of stone heater for maybe $2,000. And sauna therapy, as you may already know, has been shown to help with recovery, with sleep, with mood, with cognitive decline, with cardiovascular disease, with really death from any cause, this measure called all-cause mortality, including recovery. And then this is also where cold tank can be phenomenal. A cold shower, or maybe twice per week, you buy 3 bags of ice on your way home from the grocery store, fill up your tub, put the bags of ice in your tub, and you sit in there for 10 minutes. Wouldn't really be the hardest thing in the world to do. And cold therapy can definitely help with recovery, which is why so many athletes use it. And then another thing to consider would be some type of adrenal support, just as another idea, not because there's something wrong with your adrenal glands, but because things like ginseng and rhodiola, amongst many of the other formulas, some of the formulas will have adrenal glandulars, some will have B vitamins and vitamin C. I really don't think the exact formula makes a huge difference, but these may help with vigor and recovery. Again, not because there's anything wrong with the adrenals, but because the contents of adrenal formulas oftentimes have been shown to help with things like vigor, recovery. So something else for you to consider. And Scott, if I've missed anything there that's pretty obvious, feel free to add in.
Yeah, I mean, for me, carbohydrate intake was really
great
big.
point.
Because I was working out and just feeling tired, and then once I think it might have just been eating more food in general, that plus more protein, more carbs, and especially more electrolytes. That plus adrenal support, I don't get tired after working out, and I'm doing a lot more working out. Like I almost 5-6 days a week now, and I'm feeling better. When I miss a day, I feel so much more tired. So it's very consistent in the last 4 weeks. Every day that I've missed, I'm more tired, more groggy those days. So I think getting to the other side of that fatigue after working out it's just fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, great point with getting in enough calories, enough carbs, like we alluded to earlier, and also good reminder on the electrolytes, because you're right, especially for some people if they're avoiding salt, then the electrolytes can be really helpful. And this is where we like the LMNT. There's other good formulas out there, but what I like about the LMNT is it doesn't have a lot of sugars and other kind of crap in there, and it's a pretty salt-forward electrolyte.
And they taste amazing.
They're pretty good.
All right. Next question, second to last question here is from Mary, another thyroid question. I have Hashimoto's and I am on Armour Thyroid. And so she's been on that for some time. And since starting triple probiotics and improving my diet, I have started to feel more tired. Insomnia is worse and my heart is racing more. So she asked, can too much thyroid hormone cause fatigue? And then I'll have a backup question here is this related to her probably improving her gut health as well?
Right. Yeah, this is phenomenal. So there's a few things here to dissect. Is it Hashimoto's along with hypothyroid? Because these are not the same. If you have Hashimoto's, you're at higher risk for hypothyroid, but the risk is quite small. So you want to go back to and double check the labs before you started on the Armour. Look at your TSH and your free T4. If those were in the normal ranges for the lab, not for what your provider said, for the lab, then that suggests you are euthyroid, normal thyroid, and don't need the hormone. So double check that. Don't change anything until you check in with a healthcare provider, but that's at least what you want to check, and then bring that either to your current prescribing, or if you feel like they're a little bit dogmatic, get a second opinion, because you may not actually need the Armour, again, unless you're truly hypothyroid, high TSH with low free T4, then you don't need the Armour. And this is something that we've published on and has been fairly well documented, at least in some of the early literature, that probiotics or other interventions that improve gut health can improve the absorption of thyroid hormone. So what that means is if your absorption improves, you may now be overdosed by the Armour. So the insomnia and the racing heart, and actually the fatigue, all three of these, fatigue, insomnia, and racing heart, are all chief symptoms of thyroid hormone medication overdose. So I would definitely do a follow-up panel to see if now the TSH is low and the T4 is high. And if that's the case, a dose adjustment could be required. That's the most likely scenario at play here. Again, we've published on this, and there have been studies with probiotics. Separately, there have been studies with rifaximin. Separately, there have been studies with antibiotics for H. pylori, all showing that treatment of the gut through improving absorption can lower the amount of thyroid hormone medication required. Yay, that's awesome, right? The other thing that could be at play here is you may be having an intolerance reaction to the probiotic. This is easy to suss this out. You could always just stop the probiotic for a few days, and if those symptoms go away pretty quickly, and then you reintroduce the probiotics and they come back, it could be an intolerance reaction. So there's two things here for you to think about. Improved gut health, improved absorption, now causing overdosing of the armor, or you are experiencing a negative reaction to the probiotic.
If she had been on the probiotic for, let's say, a month, and then she started to experience the symptoms, how likely is it that it's the probiotic and not just,
Scott, you must be a savvy clinician with these questions. This is perfect, right? So, yeah,
thank you.
Usually reactions will occur fairly acutely, meaning they start on day 1, 2, or 3 early on, if it's an intolerance or allergic type reaction. And again, Scott, awesome question. If the probiotics felt okay at first, but after a few weeks, you start noticing these problems, that's probably because probiotics healing the gut, absorption improving, and then thyroid hormone levels are going too high. So the time delineation there, Mary, may help you with that.
And also just to point out that I had recently had a patient, 70-year-old guy who just suddenly stopped his thyroid medication, and he just started feeling exhausted, sluggish, groggy. We got his labs back. His TSH was up to 75. His T3 and T4 were both low, and 75, by the way, is really high. The normal range is 0.5 to 4.5 or so. And he restarted the thyroid, and he felt fantastic. So that's a really good example. Just to be clear, there are people who do need thyroid hormone, but and he clearly needed it. So, and this is where it's just good to have a savvy clinician on board to just help figure these things out, because he was like, I don't need that thyroid hormone, and just not taking a sort of dogmatic approach. He clearly did.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. We don't want to be dogmatic. We oftentimes have to play sort of the devil's advocate position to questioning if people need thyroid hormone, because of the 2 recent studies that clocked in on this, a meta-analysis showing 37% of people did not need their thyroid hormone, and another study showing that about 61% of people did not need their thyroid hormone. So because of that, we're attuned to people on medication who don't need it, but we don't want to be dogmatic and make the egregious mistake of telling everyone to come off their thyroid hormone medication. So like you said earlier, Scott, your body is boss, and then we'll examine this issue objectively and make a decision based upon the best evidence and the person's response, rather than having some sort of philosophical, paradigm that we're ardently sort of stuck in.
All right. Last question. And it's actually a 3-part question from me. So first question, if you could only make one recommendation to help somebody improve their energy levels, what would it be?
Out of all the things, I think sleep is probably the most impactful. Now, it's maybe such a common recommendation that people gloss over when they hear that, but getting to bed at the appropriate time, making sure that you have uninterrupted sleep, and then ideally being able to sleep until your body wakes up. Those aren't easy things to kind of dial in. So I would say, out of all the things, if I miss a workout, if I miss a supplement, if I miss a good night's sleep, the sleep has the highest level of impact the next day, 100%.
Yeah, I heard, it might have been Matthew Walker. He said basically, think about either going 24 hours without sleep, 24 hours without water, 24 hours without food. What would have the biggest impact on you? And that's just really puts it into perspective. So, all right, so sleep sounds good. Now, second part is, what is the best thing that you personally have done to improve your energy levels?
Lately, there's been 2 things that have changed, and because they've happened overlapping, I'm not clear on which one is the predominant driver. Cold plunge. And like I was telling you before we started recording, I did 6.5 minutes this morning in 38-degree water. And
That's it?
man, I feel fantastic. And I've been building up to it, but over the past maybe 2 weeks, I went from my baseline of maybe 1 minute to 90 seconds and then getting out. And I said, you know what? I kind of want to push this a little bit. And mainly because my friend Reed Traeger, who was on the podcast recently, was telling me that I think he's doing 10 minutes. Now he's doing 10 minutes at maybe 50 degrees, but that reminded me of ice bath therapy for athletes. And they're not doing 1 minute. They're doing, I think, on average about 10 or maybe 15. So I said to myself, let me see if I can start pushing this to try to get not just the sort of neurological invigoration effect from the minute, but really get some of that anti-inflammatory effect that will likely only be achieved from a longer time in the cold water. So 1 minute turned into 3, and a few days there turned into 5. And then now I'm hitting around 6 or 7. And even that after 3 days is feeling easier. And I have to say, when I get out, ironically, my body feels so loose. Sometimes my hips can get a little bit tight. And I just noticed that even though you're kind of cold and that's a little bit confining and restrictive, my joints and my body just feel loose and relaxed. My mood is fantastic. So yeah, I really feel that is probably having a notable impact, certainly on some of the admittedly small, but aches and pains that I'd have here and there. Those seem to have pretty much gone away. Not sure if that's totally from the cold or not. And then my daytime energy, pretty fantastic. Now, one other thing I changed in parallel was the addition of a peptide, CJC 1295 with ipamorelin. Now, I had been using this peptide on and off for a couple of years. And if you had asked me this 3 months ago, I would have said, I don't think CJC with IMPA does anything. But I think that's because I was on it for probably 8 months continuously. And the effects I was seeing at month 1 or 2 diminished with prolonged use. Now, with peptides, at least according to my knowledge, it's helpful to cycle on, cycle off so that you don't build receptor desensitization. I made the mistake, and this is for our patients and audience, that I'm victim of the same thing of being really busy, seeing some benefit from the peptide and not wanting to stop because I had lots going on. And I said, it's just not a good time to stop. So, good reminder for all of us that for some things, cyclical use actually allows you to maintain the effect. So what sort of happened over a 6-month period was at first, I do think the peptide was helping, and then the effect sort of diminished. Hence my conclusion from a few months ago that the peptide did nothing. About a week and a half ago, I brought the peptide back on, and there's 2 things I noticed from that. Again, that overlap with the cold, so I'm not really sure which one had more benefit, but I do have a suspicion that the peptide, I would say a 70% level of confidence of the peptide, led to no more midday fatigue. Sometimes middle of the day, you're going hard all morning, and then you have a snack or you have lunch, and there's that lull. And oftentimes I would end up taking a short nap. It would be a little bit of a struggle to get to the gym. And now there's no nap, no hesitation, no having to kind of motivate myself to go to the gym. And then back half of the day, same thing, maybe around 7 or 8, I would kind of hit this wall where I just wanted to chill on the couch, listen to some music, maybe watch a little bit of TV, even though I'm really not a big TV guy. And that has turned into, are there chores, music, what needs to be done? And just kind of that additional hour or maybe 2 of energy at the end of the day. The other thing here that complicates the read is, and sorry if this is long-winded, but these are how I think about these things, because I want to be careful not to say it's the peptides or it's the cold, but really think about what's changed. And I've been, as you know, Scott, doing this progressively higher volume of zone 2 cardio along with the VO2 max runs at the end of that. And at first that was really hard. Now that feels a lot easier. And I think I've gotten through that sort of period of extra load on my body. My body's now adapted, and my energy output, I think, is probably higher because of that. My suspicion is the exercise may be giving me a 30% bump. The cold might be giving me a 30% bump, and the peptides might be giving me, maybe a 40% bump. That would be if I had to guesstimate how those all interplayed together. So sorry for the long answer, but those are a few things that have really seemed to hit lately. I would also just echo something like peptides. I would only recommend if you're at a level where you're eating adequate, you're sleeping adequate, your training's dialed in, you have no symptoms that you're trying to grapple with, other than maybe a couple little things that you're trying to optimize. Would definitely not be for the person who has active GI symptoms and is struggling with fatigue.
Yep. Awesome. All right. Last question is, what is the one thing that you thought would help your energy, but it kind of fell flat and did not help?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many because I am constantly experimenting with things. I've used 2 different conative peptides. One was called cerebrolysin, I believe, and the other was called synapsin. And nothing from either one of those. In fact, one of them gave me heart palpitations. It's part of the reason why I'm a little bit more squeamish on most peptides. And the dirty secret about so many peptides is they have 0 interventional evidence in humans, or maybe 1 trial in Alzheimer's, like 1 small trial in Alzheimer's patients, which is different than otherwise healthy individuals. So goose eggs for the conative peptides, at least in my experience. NAD, I've used NMN, I've used NAD, different forms, and never seen anything from NAD. In fact, I think that actually made my energy worse. And that's also an area where there's not a great body of evidence, even though it's such a popular supplement. And I think we are going to be doing a review on the evidence for NAD and kind of reporting back on that. But for me anyway, did not help at all. And in fact, made me feel a little bit worse. And low carb. I recently tried, again, this is maybe 4 months ago, low carb and then even keto. And I will admit that during the day, my energy seemed pretty good, but then my sleep was terrible. And I'm assuming had I done that long enough, I would have really started to have fatigue. Now, to the person who says, well, you're not keto adapted, I hear your argument. My reply would be, I just do not think that keto is the right metabolic choice for everyone. And I really don't care for the thinking that everyone should be able to do this thing. Anytime we have this absolutist recommendation that everyone should be able to do X, Y, Z, I think we're now in the territory of dogma. So for me, low carb, keto, it was not good.
Gotcha. Okay. And you tried mitochondrial support too?
Yes. Things like CoQ10, PQQ, or is it PPQ? There's a handful of mitochondrial supplements that I've experimented with, and I can't say I've noticed any benefit from those. But those were so long ago, and there were way too many variables changing at the same time, admittedly, for me to really get a read. That being said, gotcha. Dr. Scott Scher, who's been on the podcast before, his hypothesis is the reason why I don't do well with keto and low carb is due to a mitochondrial issue. Now, this does not make sense to me because, as you've seen, Scott, athletic performance, pretty decent. I don't think if I had a overt mitochondrial issue, I'd be as healthy and high functioning as I am. However, I'm also willing to entertain where my blind spots may be. So I did a sort of comprehensive metabolic analysis with a lab I'm not going to name through Dr. Scott's recommendation. And those results should be in within a few days. He'll look at them, put me on a protocol, and then we'll see. Now, worst case scenario, I wasted $500 or so on this test. And then maybe a few $100s on whatever supplements I use or whatever the recommendation is. Best case scenario, it's fantastic. And all of a sudden I notice that I can do keto and am fine and see an even better level of energy and maybe athletic performance. And we identify sort of a gap in our purview clinically that we can now sort of plug. I don't think that's very likely, but again, as confident as I am about some of our observations, I'm also willing to periodically challenge my own beliefs to see if I have a blind spot. So I will report back on that once I've been through the experiment, but we'll see.
Cool. Awesome. Can't wait to hear about it. All right. Well, that's all our questions then. We made it through them all.
All right. Well, Scott, thank you. And to our audience, hopefully this helps you navigate all these options. I mean, certainly we see people who have had issues with diet, with thyroid, with doctors. So keep these questions coming. I really do feel that these help us, meaning Scott and myself, stay attuned to the things that you guys are struggling with. And thankfully, they are the same things that when we're in clinical consults with patients one-on-one, we hear people gripe about or, struggle with also. But getting those out to a broader audience, I think is hugely helpful. So if you have questions, if you're struggling, please keep the questions coming. And Scott, thank you again. And we will see everyone next time.